primary task is to put people to work. This is no unsolvable problem if we face it wisely and courageously. It can be accomplished in part by direct recruiting by the government itself.
People on the streets, begging for food. Many of them homeless without a job. The once prosperous nation had become stricken with immense poverty. Yet, only a couple years before this, the U.S. had entered a new era of economic development. Many Americans were experiencing a great sensation of economic growth in a time referred to as the Roaring Twenties.
People were enjoying all the modern luxuries the world had to offer and were becoming rich through trading stocks on Wall Street. The prices of stocks seemed to never have a limit, and people began to lose sight of the underlying economic trends that were occurring. The price of stocks eventually did reach its height, and investors rapidly began to sell, resulting in a loss to the equivalent of $396 billion today. Within a time of panic and pain, the newly elected president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, implemented New Deal policies to try bringing the country back on its feet.
The president's ideas, however, may not have been the best decision.
The New Deal policies failed in turning around the U.S. economy from the Great Depression, as it could not prevent the dramatic increase of federal taxes, doubling of government debt, and the continuation of high unemployment rates, resulting in frustration in the citizenry.
In attempts to bring relief from the Great Depression, the government created programs that promoted jobs and remedied the financial instability. The projects, however, came with an unwelcome side effect, as the heavy amounts of government spendings were financed by tripling federal taxes from $1.6 billion in 1933 to $5.3 billion in 1940.
The high taxes affected many citizens by putting strain on people's income, since the Congress raised the top income tax rate from 25% to 63%.
Low-income communities were impacted as well, when FDR insisted on payroll levies to help finance New Deal programs, resulting in social antipathy toward FDR's policies.
Therefore, when the government launched certain New Deal programs meant to help the living conditions of the impoverished, some were skeptical, saying,
"If we build 100,000 units of housing in Chicago this year, we will need several hundred more schoolrooms, and that means higher taxes."
While the programs briefly made jobs, the taxes did little to aid the economy.
In fact, recent studies suggest that with the tax rates hiking exceedingly, the government programs contributed significantly to the downturn or the slower recovery during the Great Depression. Overall, the government intervention in the Depression proved ineffective, and the gross domestic product, or GDP, continued to stay relatively low. Despite FDR's efforts, the increased taxes could not turn around the economy, but rather led the government into perpetual debt.
Even with the government's attempts to fund the New Deal programs through the increase of taxes, federal spending did not result in the recovery of the economy. The government, however, still pressed on with New Deal policies, which in turn led the U.S. into the largest peacetime debt increase of all time, setting a new debt to GDP record of 44% in 1934.
FDR, nonetheless, believed in the potential of the New Deal policies. Therefore, he kept searching for sources of money.
As a result, his administration introduced a borrowing program, which quickly amassed a total of nearly $32 billion in debt.
As the Depression deepened, FDR's sources for money became scarce, and the economy was unable to decrease the debt. Countries abroad, which were once willing to lend, became reluctant to help after seeing the sudden slump in international trade. The debt only continued to climb. In a span of just a few years, the U.S. gross debt rose from $16.2 billion in 1930 to $62.4 billion in 1933.
Such a drastically increased debt alarmed the citizens, and many began to ask,
How are they going to get the money?
with increasing number of people questioning the effectiveness of the New Deal. FDR spoke up and reassured everyone that
with us. Federal revenues are increasing. Emergency expenditures are decreasing. A balanced budget is on the way. Does that sound like bankruptcy to you?
FDR's consolation, however, was soon overshadowed as the U.S. continued to face high unemployment. While the programs implemented by FDR were helpful for short-term recovery in jobs, a long-term provision of employment was the New Deal's main goal. The New Deal, however, was never able to lower unemployment rates back to the pre-Depression state. Rather, the government spending sent unemployment back up to 19% in 1938 from 14.3% in 1937. People were desperate for work, and whenever there was a job opening, several hundred would show up, willing to get paid only $1 a week. Citizens begging for work was a common sight, and at the peak of the Depression, the total workforce of 12,830,000 people was unemployed. A number of New Deal programs that were used to help workers actually did more harm to employment than improve it. The National Industrial Recovery Act, for example, was meant to boost declining prices in products, put regulations on working standards, and set a minimum wage. With the increased wage and regulations, employers were less likely to hire at all, which caused businesses to fail. The Secretary of Treasury himself confessed that, "We have never made good on our promises. I say, after 8 years of this administration, we have just as much unemployment as we started." While the New Deal slightly helped unemployment rates, the small decrease was not enough to bring about financial stability. The government's intervention through the New Deal redefined the government's role in times of crisis. The citizens who were once expected to deal with issues alone now turned to the government for help. Programs such as Social Security and welfare use about 6% of the federal budget, and about 61 million people still benefit from it to this day. The government support, however, may not have been beneficial to the people, as some argue that over-reliance weakened the character. The New Deal was also unable to diminish unemployment rates and only raised taxes and federal debt throughout its service. Without much lasting change over the course of a decade, the people became increasingly frustrated with the slow financial progress. A prime example of this unrest is the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which forced farmers to kill off any surplus of animals in order to increase demand on livestock. While the act highly benefited farmers, the citizens responded with protests, chanting "Poor little piggies," believing that the killing of animals was a waste and unfair to the consumers. With the continuing outcry from the people, the Supreme Court eventually ruled the act unconstitutional. With their increasing frustration, many people sought out groups to blame for the nation's troubles. Local authorities in the country would go around shaking down immigrants, scaring them to death, making raids on their stores and their dance halls and their private dwellings. Mexicans who received the lowest pay in the country were often used as scapegoats for the people's frustration. The resentment for Mexican immigrants is still an issue today. President Trump demonstrated his distrust for immigrants as he states, "They're taking our manufacturing jobs. They're taking our money. They're killing us."
Although the New Deal raised people's morale, provided relief, and redefined the role of the government, the frustration and restlessness of the citizenry is due to the ineffectiveness of the New Deal policies.